Imagine a world where a whisper could shatter your life, where a single accusation could strip you of everything you hold dear, and where justice was a concept as murky as a medieval bog. What if that world was yours, and the accusation was one of infidelity, leveled against you, a woman, in the year 1168? Number 5. The easiest way to lose everything you are. The accusation itself, a mere breath of rumor, felt like a cold stone dropped into a still, clear pond, sending ripples that spread wider and wider until they touched every corner of your existence. In 1168, a woman's identity was inextricably woven into the social and moral tapestry of her community. Her worth, her standing, her very survival depended not just on her actions, but on the perception of her actions by others. To be accused of infidelity was not merely to be accused of a private transgression. It was to be accused of betraying the very foundations of society, of offending God, and of disgracing your family name. It was to be accused of being something fundamentally, terrifyingly other. Imagine Elara, a woman of gentle birth, her days filled with the rhythms of her household, the quiet industry of weaving, the raising of her young children. Her life, though often circumscribed by the expectations of her rank and gender, was one of relative stability and known purpose. She was the mistress of her home, the keeper of its warmth, the embodiment of its virtue. Her husband, Lord Alaric, though often stern, was her protector, her provider, and the linchpin of her security. Her reputation was her shield, crafted not from steel, but from years of diligent observance of custom, of piety, of modest behavior, and of unwavering loyalty to her marriage vows. It was a shield forged in the eyes of her neighbors, her servants, the village priest, and even the itinerant merchants who occasionally passed through their lands. It was the armor that allowed her to navigate the complex social landscape, to command respect, and to ensure the future of her children. Then came the whisper. Perhaps it began with a jealous servant, a disgruntled neighbor, or a rival who saw an opportunity to undermine Lord Alaric. Perhaps it was a desperate, misguided attempt by someone to shift blame away from themselves. Origins of such a rumor were often opaque, yet their power was absolute. The accusation, no matter how baseless, struck first at this shield of reputation. It did not merely scratch it, it shattered it into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The initial impact was often internal, a sickening lurch in the stomach, a sudden coldness that crept through the veins. Elara might first notice the subtle shifts in behavior around her. The servants, once deferential, might exchange glances behind her back, their whispers growing louder, their tasks performed with a barely concealed insolence. The women of the village, who once greeted her with warmth and shared remedies for ailments or gossip about the harvest, might now avert their eyes, their smiles stiff and fleeting, their conversations abruptly ceasing as she approached. Children, usually quick to run to her, might cling to their nurses, their innocent faces reflecting the unspoken anxieties of their elders. This social freeze-out was a profound and terrifying loss of identity. Elara was no longer merely Elara, the lady of the manor, the mother, the wife. She became Elara, the accused. This new identity, thrust upon her by a malicious word, overshadowed everything she had ever been, everything she had worked to build. Her very essence was reduced to a singular, damning accusation. The warmth of community, which was the very air medieval society breathed, became a suffocating void. She was isolated, a pariah in her own home, in her own village. Trust and respect that formed the bedrock of her daily interactions evaporated, replaced by suspicion and thinly veiled contempt. Consider the intricate web of relationships that defined a woman's life in 1168. Position within the household, her authority over servants, her influence in the upbringing of her children, her role in managing the estate, all of these depended on her perceived virtue and honor. With an accusation of infidelity, her authority crumbled. Servants might openly defy her, questioning her commands, knowing that her husband, their lord, might soon cast her out. Children, particularly the older ones, might be confused and distressed by the sudden change in their mother's status, perhaps even instructed to keep their distance, lest her perceived sin taint them. The fabric of her domestic life, once a source of stability and control, would unravel with terrifying speed. Beyond her immediate household, the loss of reputation extended to her wider kin. A woman's honor was intrinsically linked to the honor of her family. Accusation of infidelity brought shame not only upon herself, but upon her parents, her siblings, and her entire lineage. Father, who had carefully negotiated her marriage and likely provided a substantial dowry, would feel the sting of public humiliation, his reputation as a wise and honorable man tarnished. His alliances, his standing among other lords, could be weakened. Unmarried sisters might find their own marriage prospects diminished, as potential suitors would be wary of marrying into a family tainted by such scandal. Her married sisters might face social ostracism themselves, their own husbands wary of being associated with the disgraced kin. This ripple effect of shame was a profound and terrifying form of loss. It was not just the loss of her personal standing, but the loss of her place within a larger, interconnected familial structure that offered protection, support, and identity. In a society where family ties were paramount, being disowned or distanced by your own kin was akin to being cut adrift in a vast, unforgiving ocean. The legal and social consequences would follow, but the initial gut-wrenching loss was that of her very self, her dignity, and her connection to the world she knew. She became a non-person, her past erased by the blight of the present accusation. It was the first, and perhaps most insidious, layer of her complete destruction. Number 4, the shadow of the church and its unforgiving gaze. While the immediate social fallout of an infidelity accusation was devastating, the terrifying shadow of the church loomed even larger, threatening not only a woman's worldly existence but her immortal soul. In 1168, the church was not merely a spiritual guide. It was a powerful legal institution, its canon law often superseding or operating in parallel with secular law, especially in matters of marriage, morality, and sin. Adultery, known as fornication when unmarried, was a grave sin, a direct transgression against God's commandments and the sacred sacrament of marriage. The church's gaze was omnipresent, its judgment absolute, and its power to inflict spiritual and social penalties immense. Imagine Elara again, her reputation already in tatters among her neighbors. Now, the whispers reach the ears of the local priest. He is not just a shepherd of souls, he is an agent of ecclesiastical law, bound to uphold the sanctity of marriage and to investigate moral transgressions within his parish. Her husband, perhaps pressured by the rumor, might present the accusation to the priest, seeking either a formal pronouncement of her guilt or a church inquiry into the matter. Church court, known as the archdeacon's court or the bishop's court, became a new arena of terror, one where the stakes were infinitely higher than mere social standing. The proceedings in a church court were often inquisitorial. While evidence might be presented, the emphasis was on confession, penance, and the salvation of the soul. A woman accused of infidelity would be summoned before the ecclesiastical authorities, often a somber and intimidating assembly of clerics. The atmosphere itself would be heavy with moral judgment, the air thick with the scent of incense, and the unspoken weight of divine displeasure. Unlike secular courts, which focused on tangible property or bodily harm, the church courts delved into the spiritual state of the accused, seeking to purify and punish the sin. The fear of excommunication was a profound and constant dread. To be excommunicated was to be cast out from the community of believers, denied the sacraments, and considered a pariah in the eyes of God. It meant no baptism for her children, no last rites for her dying relatives, no burial in consecrated ground for herself. It was a sentence of spiritual death, effectively damning her soul to eternal torment in hellfire. While less common for a first accusation of simple adultery than for heresy or persistent defiance, the threat was always there, a terrifying lever of control wielded by the church. Even if excommunication was not immediately imposed, the penance prescribed by the church could be brutally public and humiliating. Imagine Elara being ordered to stand barefoot at the church doors during Mass, perhaps clothed in a penitential sackcloth, her head bowed in shame, as her neighbors and former friends filed past her, their faces a mixture of pity and condemnation. She might be forced to confess her sins publicly, her voice trembling as she recounted her alleged transgression before the entire congregation. This public penance was not merely a symbolic act. It was designed to inflict profound spiritual and social pain, to break the individual's pride, and to serve as a stark warning to others. The shame was suffocating, branding her as a public sinner in the eyes of God and man. Beyond the humiliation, the church's judgment carried tangible consequences. It could effectively endorse the husband's accusation, granting him justification for further actions. The church found her guilty. It could decree the separation of the couple, known as a divorce a mensa et thoro, or from bed and board. This was not a modern divorce that allowed remarriage, as marriage was indissoluble in the eyes of God. Instead, it meant the couple could no longer live together, effectively dissolving the domestic unit. For the woman, this meant being cast out from her home, her husband no longer obligated to support her dower rights potentially forfeited. The church, by its decree, could leave her destitute and alone. Furthermore, the church's involvement in determining the legitimacy of children was critical. If a woman was found guilty of adultery, the paternity of any children born during the period of the alleged affair could be called into question, with devastating implications for inheritance and social standing. Church's rulings on such matters, based on canonical principles, directly impacted the future of her lineage and her children's rights. The church's power extended even to the very definition of a family. The fear of the church's gaze was multifaceted. It was the fear of eternal damnation, a torment far more enduring than any earthly suffering. It was the fear of public shaming, of being stripped of all dignity before her community. It was the fear of losing her spiritual solace, of being cut off from the only source of comfort and hope in a harsh world. And it was the terrifying understanding that the church's judgment, once rendered, was nearly irreversible, a stain that would follow her beyond the grave, a shadow that would never truly lift. Church, acting as both spiritual guide and legal arbiter, held immense and terrifying power over the accused woman, its judgment a constant, unforgiving presence. Number 3, when your home becomes your prison. An accusation of infidelity in 1168 did not merely threaten a woman's reputation or her soul. It threatened her very physical existence and independence, transforming the familiar sanctuary of her home into a stark, terrifying prison. For a woman, her home was the center of her universe, the sphere where she held a degree of influence and where her daily life unfolded. It was the place where her children were born and raised, where her belongings were kept, and where her identity as a wife and mother was rooted. To be accused meant that this very foundation could be ripped away, leaving her utterly exposed and vulnerable. Imagine Elara, stripped of her dignity by the church's decree of penance, her social standing in tatters. Now the tangible consequences of her husband's wrath, fueled by the accusation and perhaps by the church's endorsement, begin to materialize. Lord Alaric, his honor impugned, his lineage potentially threatened, had every right by the customs and laws of the time to take decisive action against his accused wife. His home was his domain, and she, in a legal sense, was his property. The most immediate and terrifying consequence was the forfeiture of her dower and dowry. A woman's dowry was the property or wealth she brought into the marriage, often intended to provide for her and her children, and to compensate the husband for taking on the responsibilities of marriage. Her dower was the portion of her husband's estate, usually 1/3, that she was legally entitled to for her lifetime if he died. These were her only economic safety nets. However, almost universally, infidelity was grounds for their complete forfeiture. Imagine Elara watching as her personal chests are emptied, her few prized possessions, perhaps a silver brooch from her mother, a finely embroidered shift seized. Clothing, her furniture, even the bed she shared with her husband, would no longer be hers. She would be stripped bare, not just of her personal property, but of any future claim to the security her marriage once offered. Her very means of subsistence would vanish, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, utterly dependent on the dubious charity of others. The loss of her home was not merely about material possessions, it was about the brutal severance from her children. In 1168, children were considered the property of the father and his lineage. A mother accused of infidelity had little to no legal claim to her offspring. Imagine Elara's heart being torn asunder as her children, her beloved son and daughter, are forcibly kept from her. She would see them perhaps across a courtyard or through a window, but she would not be allowed to comfort them, to teach them, to raise them. Their young minds, already confused by the scandal, would be encouraged to distance themselves from their sinful mother. This was a form of psychological torture, a loss far more devastating than any material deprivation. The bond of motherhood, which was often the core of a woman's being, would be brutally severed. Furthermore, a husband had the right, and often the social expectation, to remove his accused wife from the marital home. This removal could take many forms, each terrifying in its own way. She might be literally cast out, forced to wander as a vagrant, with no place to go, no one to take her in. family, shamed by the accusation, might refuse to welcome her back. Imagine Elara standing outside the gates of the manor she had called home for years, the heavy oak doors closing behind her, sealing her fate, the cold wind biting at her exposed skin, nowhere to turn. Alternatively, she might be confined. Not necessarily in a dungeon, but perhaps in a small, remote chamber within the manor itself, or in a distant, secluded house on the estate, or even forcibly sent to a nunnery. This last option, forced seclusion in a convent, was a common practice for women deemed problematic or disgraced. While offering physical safety and a roof over her head, it was a life sentence of spiritual and social isolation, a permanent removal from the secular world, without having chosen a religious vocation. Imagine Elara stripped of her secular attire, dressed in a coarse habit, her hair shorn, her days filled with prayers and chores she never sought, separated from her family, her friends, her entire former life, all without her consent. The nunnery, intended as a place of pious contemplation, would become her gilded cage, her freedom extinguished by the decree of others. The home, once a sanctuary, was transformed into a prison, or its gates became the point of her banishment. The terrifying prospect was the absolute loss of agency, the complete dissolution of her rights and her future. Without home, without children, without property, and without a place in society, a woman accused of infidelity in 1168 faced a terrifying abyss of destitution and oblivion. Her very existence, once vibrant and meaningful, would be reduced to a shadowy, solitary suffering, the walls of her former life closing in around her, suffocating her spirit. This profound loss of physical freedom and familial connection was a living death, a constant reminder of the catastrophic power of a single accusation. Number 2, the spectacle of public humiliation and pain. Beyond the social ostracism, the church's spiritual judgment, and the profound loss of home and family, there loomed a terrifying and very real possibility of public humiliation and corporal punishment. In 1168, justice was often enacted not just through legal pronouncements, but through highly visible, symbolic acts designed to shame, deter, and physically mark the accused. For a woman accused of infidelity, this meant the potential for public spectacle, where her body and her dignity became tools for societal retribution, leaving scars far deeper than any physical wound. Imagine Elara having endured the initial shock of accusation, the cold shoulder of her community, and the stern pronouncements of the church. Now, as the accusations solidify or gain traction, the machinery of secular justice, or even local custom, might seize her. While death was a rare punishment for simple adultery in England in 1168, unless coupled with other severe crimes, or under very specific, harsh local codes, other forms of bodily punishment and public shaming were very much in play. One of the most horrifying prospects was the trial by ordeal. This was not a legal proceeding based on evidence and testimony in the modern sense. Instead, it was an appeal to divine judgment, a brutal test believed to reveal God's truth. The most common forms were the ordeal of hot iron or the ordeal of cold water. Imagine Elara, her heart pounding in her chest, surrounded by a solemn crowd, her accusers looking on. For the ordeal of hot iron, she might be forced to carry a searingly hot piece of iron for a prescribed distance, perhaps 9 feet, or plunge her hand into boiling water to retrieve an object. Her hand would then be bandaged and inspected 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was considered a sign of God's favor and her innocence. If it was festering, it was a sign of her guilt. Terrifying reality was that infection was rampant in medieval times. The odds were stacked against her. Even if declared innocent by some miracle, the physical pain and the lingering scars would be a constant reminder of her terrifying experience. The ordeal of cold water was equally terrifying. Elara might be bound with ropes, her right thumb tied to her left big toe, and then thrown into a body of consecrated water, a pond, a river, or a specially prepared pit. If she sank, it was believed the pure water accepted her, signifying innocence. If she floated, it meant the water rejected her, signifying guilt, as her body was perceived as being too impure to be embraced by the sacred element. Imagine the terror of being submerged, the desperate struggle for breath, the humiliation of being publicly stripped and thrown into the water, regardless of the outcome. Even if she sank and was pulled out, declared innocent, the experience would be profoundly traumatic, leaving her traumatized and vulnerable. Beyond the ordeal, public humiliation was a pervasive element of medieval punishment. Even without an official trial, a husband might decide to shame his wife publicly. She might be forced to wear a distinctive mark or clothing, indicating her supposed sin. She might be paraded through the village, subjected to jeers, insults, and even rotten vegetables thrown by the crowd. This was not just embarrassment, it was an act designed to destroy her spirit, to render her utterly defenseless in the face of communal scorn. The social impact was immediate and long-lasting, a mark of shame etched into her very being. In some extreme local customs, or if the adultery was coupled with other offenses, corporal punishment might be inflicted. Imagine the terrifying prospect of a public whipping, her back bared to the gaze of the crowd, each lash searing her skin, the pain both physical and symbolic. In certain Germanic legal traditions that might still linger in some parts of Europe, an adulterous woman could theoretically face mutilation, such as the cutting off of her nose or ears, though this was rare in 12th century England for simple adultery. Even so, the mere threat of such brutality, the knowledge that her body could be violated as a consequence of the accusation, would be an ever-present, bone-chilling fear. The spectacle of public humiliation and pain was designed to strip a woman of her dignity, to assert the power of the husband and the community, and to serve as a stark warning to others. It was a terrifying culmination of the social and legal pressures brought to bear upon an accused woman. Her body, her physical self, became the canvas upon which society painted its judgment, leaving indelible marks of shame, suffering, and terror. Even if she survived, the memory of that public ordeal, the burning shame, and the physical scars would be a constant, chilling reminder of the day her world collapsed under the weight of an accusation. Number 1, the crushing absence of justice. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of being accused of infidelity as a woman in 1168 was the crushing and pervasive absence of anything resembling fair justice as we understand it today. The legal and social systems were overwhelmingly stacked against women, rendering them virtually powerless in the face of an accusation. Their voices were diminished, their rights almost non-existent, and the very concept of an impartial, evidence-based trial was a distant dream. Imagine Elara, innocent of the charges, yet facing the full force of this bias system. Her primary accuser was likely her husband, Lord Elara. In 1168, a husband's word often carried immense weight, particularly in matters concerning his wife's chastity and his family's honor. He was the head of the household, the legal master of his wife, and his accusations, especially if backed by the testimony of disgruntled servants or vague circumstantial evidence, would be readily believed. The legal system was not designed to protect the accused woman. It was designed to protect the husband's property rights, his lineage, and societal order, which presumed female chastity. A woman had extremely limited legal standing. She could not initiate legal proceedings without her husband's consent, nor could she usually act as a witness in court unless under very specific, rare circumstances, and even then, her testimony would be viewed with suspicion. This meant that Elara, though she knew herself to be innocent, would struggle to even present her case. She could not call witnesses on her own behalf, could not cross-examine her accusers effectively, and her own protestations of innocence might be dismissed as lies born of guilt or feminine deceit. Her very gender predisposed the courts and society to doubt her. The types of courts she might face further complicated matters. There were the manorial courts, presided over by the local lord or his steward, focused on local customs and feudal obligations. There were the church courts, as discussed, concerned with sin and salvation, but also with marital matters. And the nascent royal courts under Henry II were still developing, often focusing on crimes like murder, theft, or serious land disputes, rather than private accusations of adultery unless they impacted broader peace or property. Each had its own procedures, but none prioritized the accused woman's ability to defend herself robustly. Consider the notion of evidence. In 1168, proof was often far removed from modern forensic or logical standards. Hearsay, rumor, and the sworn oaths of a few individuals, especially men of standing, could be considered compelling. Circumstantial evidence, such as a woman being seen talking alone with another man, or a perceived coldness towards her husband, could be twisted into damning proof. There was no concept of innocent until proven guilty, in a practical sense. The accusation itself created an immediate presumption of guilt in the public mind, and often within the courts. Burden of proof effectively fell on the accused to disprove the accusation, a near impossible task given the lack of legal tools available to her. Furthermore, the legal process itself was often opaque and lacked due process. There were no impartial juries of peers as we understand them today. Decisions might be made by the lord, the priest, or a small group of elders, whose personal biases or relationships with the accuser could heavily influence the outcome. The concept of an appeals process was rudimentary at best, and certainly not easily accessible to a woman stripped of her resources and freedom. But judgment was rendered against her. It was often final, binding, and devastating. Even if a woman somehow managed to avoid conviction through an ordeal or through a lack of sufficient proof for a formal charge, the accusation itself and the public process it entailed left an indelible mark. The whisper might subside, but the stain would remain. Her reputation, once shattered, could never be fully restored. She would forever be the woman who was accused, her honor irrevocably tainted, her future shadowed by suspicion. She might be allowed to remain in her home, but her husband's trust might be permanently eroded, their marriage a cold, hollow shell. Her relationship with her children might remain strained, their perception of her forever colored by the scandal. Crushing absence of justice was the ultimate terror because it meant that her fate was largely out of her hands, determined by the whims of men, the weight of rumor, and the rigid, unforgiving structures of a patriarchal society. There was no champion to rise to her defense, no impartial arbiter to weigh the facts fairly, no legal avenue to reclaim her dignity or her life. Her very voice was silenced, her existence made precarious, and her future erased by a system designed to protect the powerful, leaving the accused woman utterly vulnerable and utterly alone. In 1168, to be a woman accused of infidelity was to stare into an abyss where justice was a cruel mirage, and the truth of her innocence mattered little against the terrifying might of accusation.